All right, folks, history has been made for the first time in the history of the NFL. A quarterback has thrown more interceptions in a playoff game than they threw in the entire NFL season. For the first time in 20 years, Jason's Washington Commanders have won a playoff game. And for the first time in 14 years, we finally have the FAR CUI rule at long last to dive into. And that's what we're going to talk about today.
As somebody that's been waiting 20 years for my team to win a playoff game, and as somebody who has been waiting for the FAR CUI rule to emerge from being a unicorn or the proverbial narwhal of the regulatory environment, all well wishes and DMs of good thoughts are appreciated. Congratulatory celebrations, any messages that you have to say, hey, we're happy all this happened for you at once. I'll take them all in. Jacob, I think you will as well. Not so much on the NFL side, but we won't get into that today.
Yeah, literally, the last time the Chargers were in the Super Bowl, the last time that the Commanders won a playoff game was almost as far back as how long we've been waiting on the FAR CUI rule. Okay.
But the council gave you a nice rule to wipe your tears with. Here's
100%. It's a nice
144
consolation
pages
prize
of tissues, my friend.
It's a nice consolation prize. There's always next year.
Yes.
Okay. We're going to talk about what is the FAR CUI proposed rule. This is a very high-level survey of the FAR CUI proposed rule. This affects a lot of people who are not in the defense industrial base. This affects a lot of people who are completely unfamiliar with all of the stuff that we've talked about for years. DFARS regulations, FAR regulations, NIST standards, cybersecurity requirements, incident reporting, CMMC, all of that stuff has been unique to the defense space, and a lot of that stuff is no longer unique to the defense space. All of the topics in the rule could be their own episode. They will be their own episodes in the future, so we're going to do our best to cover as much ground as possible, give you a high-level summary of what's going on in the rule as best as we can, and then we'll take it from there in the weeks to come. Okay, so we're going to sort of buck convention here and talk about why this is happening before we do the who, what, where, when, and how. So why is this happening? Why is this happening to people? So most people are familiar with the idea of classified information, even if they don't work with it directly, even if you've never had a clearance. You're generally familiar with the idea of classified information, but people are less familiar with the huge amount of classified information that's actually handled by contractors outside of government facilities and government systems. So clearly, the government and contractors need to protect classified data regardless of where it is. Just because it's not in a government building, it's in a contractor building, doesn't mean that the classified data doesn't need to be protected anymore. That would be absurd, right? So the location of the data has nothing to do with the sensitivity of the data, which is simple enough. But what happens when we start talking about unclassified data, right? Are there ever situations where unclassified data is still sensitive enough to the point where it needs to be controlled? Not on par with classified data, but it needs to be controlled and protected in some manner, right? How about examples like law enforcement information, such as the identities of informants or ongoing investigation information, not classified, but very sensitive? What about health records, health information, genetic information, student records, taxpayer information, immigration visas, or asylee and asylum information? What about export controlled information from the Department of State? What about technical information about military weapon systems, space platforms, and their components, right? These are all forms of unclassified data that are very sensitive, that clearly need to be protected, but they aren't classified information. So clearly the government needs to protect this data, even though it's not classified. You shouldn't just post this information on public-facing government or public websites, right? Mm-hmm. And so just like classified information, contractors should also protect this unclassified information if they're dealing with it, because just because the data is, being handled by a contractor doesn't remove the sensitivity and the requirement to protect it, right? Mm-hmm. So the government struggled with this concept for years and years and years. And in 2010, Executive Order 13556 directed the creation of what is known as the Controlled Unclassified Information Program, unclassified information that needs to be controlled. It took years for the government to find and organize all of the types of classified information that have legal requirements to be protected. A lot of those examples that I listed off earlier. You can see every one of these examples in something known as the CUI registry, which is a website that we will link below. It also took years for the government to agree on a single method of marking this CUI, this controlled unclassified information, so that everybody knew what they were looking at. Beforehand, all the agencies just marked it however they wanted to. And if you didn't work at the agency, you didn't know what the marking meant. Mm-hmm. So we had to sort of create this universal method of marking things the same way. It also took years for the government to agree on what the minimum set of cybersecurity requirements would be that are universal to all these categories of CUI, as they're called. You can see those minimum requirements in a document called NIST Special Publication 800-171, which was published back in 2015. And then finally, after everything was officially organized, a regulation was issued in 2016 that established policy for all federal branch agencies on designating, safeguarding, disseminating, marking, decontrolling, and disposing of controlled unclassified information, including self-inspection and oversight requirements, and all other facets of this major federal-wide program. The rule in 2016, the federal CUI rule, which is another word for a regulation, affects all executive branch agencies that handle CUI and all organizations that handle, possess, use, share, or receive CUI, which means contractors, right? Okay, so by 2016, 6 years after the executive order, we had everything organized. We have a government-wide policy that makes federal agencies comply with all of these things. But how do we get the contractors to comply? The federal-wide regulation doesn't affect non-federal agency, executive branch agencies. How do we get the contractors dealing with the data to also comply? You need a federal-wide contract clause, something known as a federal acquisition regulation. All federal acquisition regulations are contained in something known as the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The problem was we never got the contract clause, ever. Everything happened in 2015 and 2016 except for the part that we needed to get contractors to comply with this program, even though all of these forms of data were and are and will continue to flow into supply chains and non-government environments. Mm-hmm. So as the years went by, most of the agencies were totally fine just waiting on this FAR rule, this federal acquisition regulation. They were totally fine being like, that's not our job. We'll just wait until it comes out, except for one. One agency, the Department of Defense, could not wait on this one federal acquisition regulation. The situation was so bad with their unclassified data about their weapon systems and space platforms and all this other stuff getting compromised again and again and again that they issued their own acquisition regulation supplement as a stand-in for this federal-wide rule. They issued this in 2016, and it required their contractors, their defense contractors, collectively known as the Defense Industrial Base or the DIB, to comply with the tenets of the federal CUI program and implement the minimum requirements in that NIST publication 800-171. Exactly what the FAR was supposed to do for everybody. The DoD went ahead and did it on their own because they couldn't wait any longer. It got so bad that in 2020, the situation had deteriorated even further, and the DoD issued another regulation requiring that contractors prove that they had implemented NIST SP 800-171 requirements before they could even be awarded the contract and start handling the CUI data. A few years later, here we are, and that program known as CMMC is getting ready to roll out in defense contracts in a matter of weeks or months. Meanwhile, everyone had forgotten all about the original plan for the federal-wide contract clause to do exactly what DoD was doing for their supply chain, except for us. Except for us on this podcast. I'm spiking the football. I'm doing it. We have had multiple episodes over the years reminding people that the FAR CUI rule was real, that it was coming, that it was happening, speculating about what would be in the FAR CUI rule, and pleading with people not to forget that this is not a defense-specific anomaly, that everything that's happening in the DIB with the problems with DFARS requirements and NIST requirements and CMMC requirements are the canary in the coal mine for what's coming for everybody else. And here we are on January 15th, a couple years late from what we thought, and we have the draft of the FAR CUI rule that's going to affect everybody, not just the DIB.
Better late than never, my friend.
Better late than never is one way to put it.
I've known you for a good amount of time. I've never really seen you take a victory lap. It's well deserved now. What I will say is that the names and the comments mean absolutely nothing because of the fact that the end result is what's good for everyone, and that's what we wanted from the get-go. What I want to explain and sum up everything that you just went over is pretty simple here. There was data that wasn't classified but still needed to be controlled because it posed maybe some semblance of a threat to national security, personal security, whatever it may be. The federal government, as a part of an executive order, was tasked with protecting that, to put a whole program together for the entirety of the federal government. That took forever, like 900 trillion years. And the reason why the DFARS program existed is because people were stealing data that was applicable to controlled weapons that helped with our competitive national advantage. So the DoD stepped up their game, created their own CUI registry. This is the data that's particularly important to us. Now, what we have is the FAR CUI rule, which covers all those other bits of data that didn't show up in those defense contracts that everybody chose to go to in lieu of implementing NIST 800-171 6 years ago.
Yep.
This is essentially
this is the rule that puts us back where we should have been in 2016, right? Yeah. This is not a new thing that they've cooked up. We are catching up to where we should have been in the past.
Okay. Congratulations, data security is in last decade. All right. Now we can move on.
Okay, so I've indulged myself in the history of the story. There's videos that we'll link to about the FAR CUI rule and the history of how this is all developed in the comments below. Check those out if you want more details. Okay, so let's talk about who's doing this, who's responsible for this, and who is affected. So on January 15th, 2025, the FAR Council, which is comprised of the Department of Defense, NASA, and the General Services Administration, GSA, have issued a proposed rule in the Federal Register that amends the Federal Acquisition Regulation, collectively known as the FAR, in order to implement the National Archives and Records Administration, an agency called NARA, their Controlled Unclassified Information Program, which itself is the regulation that implements Executive Order 13556 in 2010. We've come all the way down to the full implementation of all of this stuff into actual federal contracts. So who does the rule affect? The rule affects solicitations and contracts involving controlled unclassified information, except for those for the acquisition of commercial off-the-shelf items, which is a specific legal term, and federally funded basic and applied research in accordance with National Security Decision Directive 189. This is a debate and rabbit hole for the higher education folks who are listening. Basic and applied research is different from fundamental research. It's a whole other story for another day. Okay, as the rule states, as we talked about in the why this is happening, since CUI requires protection regardless of dollar value or commerciality of the product or service, this rule will apply to contracts at or below the simplified acquisition threshold of $250,000. So it doesn't matter how small or how big your contract is. If it involves CUI and it's not for a COTS product or for basic or applied research, this applies to you. Not defense contractors, not Department of State contractors. Everybody, anybody who's a federal contractor. Okay. So what does the rule do? This thing's 144 pages long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's the core of what the rule does, right? This is the center of gravity, as I would say, for this rule. The FAR CUI rule creates a standard form that will identify any controlled unclassified information that will be involved in the contract. The government will identify any controlled unclassified information in the standard form, and the standard form must be incorporated into the contract directly. It doesn't have an official number yet until the final rule comes out, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So currently it's referred to as SF, standard form, SF triple X. That's the placeholder for
It's only
standard
fitting.
form 184 or whatever it's going to be. SF triple X is what we're going to refer to it as, because that's what they refer to it in the rule. Okay, this is a huge deal, a huge, huge deal. It is the biggest deal out of the rule, which itself is a big deal. Because remember, defense contractors have had these requirements in their DFARS contract clauses, their DoD contract clauses, since 2016. But the biggest problem has been knowing if you have CUI at all. There was no standard form. There was no standard method for identifying whether they had the CUI. So we've gone around and around and around for years, where the biggest problem has been identifying the data that's going to be involved in the contract in the first place. The standard form in the FAR CUI rule, SF triple X, solves this problem for the DIB and for everybody else. So for everybody else that's not in the DIB, you lucked out. You didn't have to literally lose your hair trying to figure this problem out for the last several years.
Again, I think it needs to be emphasized. What is CUI? I don't know. Look at SF triple X.
This standard form will tell you exactly what is going on, which is good news for the DIB, because this is going to also be included in your contract. So there is hope on the horizon. Everything revolves around this standard form, whether you have obligations, don't have obligations, how the extent to which you have obligations, the details of your obligations will be outlined in the standard form that results from this rule. You can see the standard form. It's 14 pages long. If you go to the page for the proposed rule and scroll all the way to the end is where the standard form is. If you don't read anything else in the rule, you should do that, because that is your future, all federal contractors. It is that standard form. Okay, so buried within the rule, this is the official acquisition policy for the agencies. This is directing the agencies what they need to do. So this is very helpful for people to get an idea of what the rule overall does. It just so happens that it's a 7-item long list. We didn't ask them to do that. It's just a wonderful coincidence. Okay, so in FAR,
divine intervention, right?
Yeah, it's the magical number 7 here. So in FAR Part 11, which is a subsection of the overall federal acquisition regulation, it describes the policy that the agencies have to comply with when inserting this requirement into contracts. And they say, when agencies acquire products and services subject to 32 CFR Part 2002, which is the federal CUI program rule that was issued in 2016 that we talked about, the SF triple X must be incorporated in the contract and must identify at a minimum the following 7 things. 1, the CUI the contractor will handle in performance of the contract. 2, any CUI access and dissemination requirements placed on the contractor during performance of the contract. 3, federal and non-federal information systems the contractor will use to handle CUI in the performance of the contract. 4, system security and privacy requirements for each information system as appropriate, and any additional security and privacy measures required by the individual agency. 5, any instructions for handling CUI during performance of the contract. 6, any CUI training requirements the contractor must adhere to in order to comply. And 7, any CUI incident reporting instructions required by the agency to include the relevant website and the point of contact for reporting those issues. That framework is really what this rule is going to do via the standard form and via the contract clauses that correspond with the standard form in the contracts. If you were going to sum up 144 pages, that's what the rule is going to do.
So do you, and now I think that it's important to emphasize this, is that one of the things that was mentioned here is when agencies acquire, when agencies do this, when agencies do that, because it's the agency's discretion when they adopt the rule, correct?
Right.
So how now the agency
Well,
interprets and delivers this rule, right?
Well, sort of, right? Agency discretion when they adopt the rule. When it becomes a federal acquisition regulation that's final and effective, it's in effect and it's going to be put in federal contracts. Fun note here, right? If anybody's been paying attention to the defense space, you may have heard this thing called a phased rollout, where the contract clause requirement to meet a certain CMMC assessment level won't be put into all defense contracts immediately. It will be phased out over the course of 4 years. The DoD is doing this of their own volition to minimize the impact on the defense supply chain. There is no phased rollout for the FAR CUI rule. So a lot of people beat up on the DoD for creating excessive burdens on industry. There's no obligation for anybody to have a phased rollout for these contract clauses. There is no phased rollout for this.
No, but the agency obligation is to attach to this rule and carry out the mission of this rule, right? And how, and what you just mentioned is kind of what I was trying to say, is at their discretion, how do they, I don't know, not enforce it, but like you said, the DoD does a phased rollout to eliminate the burden. DHS is in the process of going through their entire, 171 thing. And we talk about, are they going to do self-assessments or are they not going to do self-assessment? That is going to come into play here because it's going to be agency specific, because some of it's not dictated within this overarching rule, which is just intended to protect
which makes it very hard to predict what it's going to look like for non-defense.
That's what I was trying to get at, but I'm terrible with words.
Right? But once the rule is final, which we'll talk about the timeline in a little bit, once the rule is final, all new federal contracts will have these requirements in them. There is no phased rollout based off size or this or data type or that or whatever. It's just going to be in contracts. So, maybe give the DoD a little bit of credit, everybody, because they're doing things that they don't have to do in order to minimize these burdens. Okay. So the standard form is really the core of the rule. That's really what is going to drive everything between the agencies and the contracting officers, identifying everything that is relevant for the contractors, the relevant data, who to talk to, what your requirements are, all that stuff. But the rule also creates 2 different contract clauses. This is a federal acquisition regulation, so it creates clauses that will go into contracts. Now, the rule is very long for a lot of reasons. We can talk about that in the future episode about why there's this big preamble for the rule and all the other things that are changed. But these clauses and the standard form are what the contractors are actually going to see in the real world, right? Okay, so it creates 2 clauses. They don't have finished numbers yet. They have placeholders because we won't have the finished numbers until the final rule is done. So 52204XX is a contract clause called controlled and classified information, of all things. 52.204-YY, identifying and reporting information that is potentially controlled and classified information. Those are the 2 clauses created by the rule. So the requirements in the clause 52204XX apply when CUI will be involved in the contract. This is going to be really fun for everybody. The requirements in the clause 52.204YY apply when CUI will not be involved in your contract. So even if you don't have to have CUI, you still are going to have obligations in your contracts. Congratulations.
52.252.204- it's crazy how it's all eerily similar.
Oh yeah. It's in the same, but it's the mailing address for the individual clauses, right? Okay.
Yep.
So for CUI identified on SFXXX that is incorporated into a contract, the contractor shall comply with the CUI requirements and in the clause 52.204XX and on the special form XXX itself. Mm-hmm. So when there will be CUI, you comply with 52.204XX and the special form. During the solicitation phase or the performance of a contract, if contractors discover information they suspect is CUI but is not listed on SFXXX or is not marked properly as required by SFXXX, then they are required to notify the government within 8 hours of discovery, thanks to 52204YY. So even if that form tells you don't have CUI, you don't have to protect it. If you find CUI later on, this clause tells you have to notify the government. Doesn't mean you have to protect it according to the clause, but you got to do something with it. So literally everyone is affected by this rule, even if you don't have CUI.
All right. So I tried to think within reason when this came out, right? Because it's obviously been a hot topic. We've discussed it multiple times. And I'm thinking that maybe there's a possibility, and don't quote me on this isn't authoritative, but maybe this 52.204-YY, which deals with the identifying and reporting information within 8 hours, may be only applicable to, I don't know, certain types of CUI, and they may only appear in those contracts. And that's why they separated it with clauses. That's only hopeful, wishful thinking, because if it's applicable to everyone and it appears in everybody's contract, this is going to be a problem.
Yeah, that's going to be a problem. We're going to talk about why in detail in a future episode, but just know that it exists.
That's what I said when I read it. Why? You know what I mean?
Just know that it exists. For the purposes of this high-level summary, the part that people really care about is 52204XX. What are my obligations when I do have CUI? What are the requirements that I have to comply with when I do have the CUI? So 52204-XX isn't really all that long. It's several paragraphs long. It outlines the actual obligations. I will link to the text of the clause directly in the description. That way you don't have to scroll through 144 pages. So this would probably be the second most important thing for you to look at in the rule after you look at the standard form. Okay, so in this clause, it says the SFXXX that is incorporated into this contract identifies what controlled unclassified information is involved in the contract. Wonderful. That's wonderful. It goes on to say the contractor is required to safeguard only the CUI that is identified in the SFXXX. Amazing. And then it goes into its other paragraphs. A bunch of the clauses taken up by definitions. Very, very important to pay attention to. We don't have the time to go into them today. Make sure you read them. It talks about reporting obligations. And it says the contractor shall notify the contracting officer within 8 hours if the contractor discovers any information that they believe is CUI that is not identified in the SFXXX or is not marked properly as required by the SFXXX, or there is any inconsistency between the clause and the SFXXX incorporated into the contract. 8 hours. 8 hours.
Bro.
That's a very fast turnaround, and it's causing a lot of heartburn for people who are reading the rule. Okay, paragraph D of the clause. This is the most impactful, most costly part of your obligation to protect CUI. So pay attention. The clause outlines all the training requirements that are required for your staff when you're dealing with CUI. It goes on to say that contractors operating information systems that access, use, process, store, maintain, or transmit CUI identified in the contract shall implement the following requirements. When the contractor is operating a non-federal information system, that means your information system that you own, the contractor shall comply with the security requirements of NIST Special Publication 800-171 Revision 2, comply with all additional security requirements for CUI specified in the SFXXX. They can add additional requirements if they want to. Implement additional information security requirements that the contractor reasonably determines necessary to provide adequate security in a dynamic environment. Yeah, right. And then comply with any requirements in NIST SP 800-172 identified by the agency. All details will be in the standard form, XXX. Jason, they specified 800-171 Revision 2. They specified 800-172 right there in the clause. If you are handling CUI in your contractor environment, 800-171 applies to you at a minimum, potentially additional requirements, potentially even 800-172 requirements, black and white, plain as day, right there in the clause and the standard form.
So let's put it into comparison. Really quickly on paragraph D, identified by the agency. So let's think of a time when that happened, where 800-172 was called out and identified by an agency. Maybe it was a premonition by the DoD, where they created CMMC level 3, right? And they selected from the goodie grab bag of advanced persistent threat CIA option enhancements, right? That were there in 800-172, and they said this is the part of the framework that we want for our most sensitive contracts. Probably what we'll see happening from the different agencies that now have to enforce this FAR CUI rule.
Yeah. Okay. So those are the basic requirements for what's
Mhm.
going on, but there are additional requirements elsewhere in the clause. For example, if you're using cloud environments, if you, the contractor, have made the decision that you are going to take controlled federal data and you are going to put it into a cloud environment, just like we talked about before, protection requirements follow the data regardless of where it goes. And so there are additional things to consider when you put it in the cloud. If the contractor uses a cloud service provider to store, process, or transmit any CUI identified in standard form XXX, the cloud service provider meets security requirements established by the government for the FedRAMP moderate baseline. The FedRAMP moderate baseline is not the same thing as NIST SP 800-171, nor is it the same thing as NIST SP 800-172, nor is it the same thing as the combination of 800-171 and 172. It is a separate baseline of security controls applicable to cloud environments. Federal contractors who haven't heard this before, if you are shopping around for people who can help you secure your CUI data through a cloud solution and they start yapping at you about 800-171, that is not what you're looking for. CUI in the cloud requires FedRAMP moderate.
I think that this is also important to point out that it's got to be identified in the SFXXX, right? So it's not like if my, I don't know, this SPA asset that I have transmits SPD. Now it's all of a sudden there. Is SPD called out in the SF86?
You're gonna have to have mercy on the federal folks who don't know what's going on. What is SPA? What is SPD?
Yeah.
Those are
So
DoD terms.
correct. Those are DoD terms. So like one of the biggest
Sorry,
concerns
everybody.
right
It's gonna take
now
a
in the
while for us to.
yeah. In CMMC, there's a classification of assets that has to happen in the environment where certain assets are classified as security protection assets. These assets provide security capabilities to CUI assets, which are assets which store, process, or transmit CUI, right? Which is what you're going to come across against. Well, there's this big, discussion back and forth of exactly the data that's transmitted as a part of those transactions for those particular assets, whether or not that's classified as CUI or not. And it's a very gray area. Guess what? The gray area doesn't exist for you. Congratulations. Half of this gray hair on the side of my head probably came from that conversation. You don't have to have it. Some people walk so you could run. Congratulations.
So fun, not fun, not a fun fact. The DoD has spent years developing and issuing scoping guidance for these requirements that you are required to implement. Other agencies have not done that. So we're right back where we started in 2016, where we don't have additional scoping guidance. That's another topic for another day about how federal agency contractors might look at DoD scoping guidance, even though they're not DoD contractors. But let's finish out what's in the clause. The clause continues that the contractor shall submit the system security plan and any associated plans of action required by NIST SP 800-171 for any planned implementations or mitigations to the government upon request to demonstrate the contractor's implementation or planned implementation of the security requirements. Now we're getting into how will the government know that you have done these things that you have attested to implementing in accordance with your clause. Now, this is not CMMC. CMMC is a DoD program to verify that DoD contractors have complied with these requirements. That is not a federal-wide verification program. So outside of the DoD, how will they ensure compliance? Well, paragraph E of the clause is literally called compliance. Let's see what they have to say. The contracting officer may require the submission of supporting documentation to verify compliance with the contract security requirements, or may require access to contractor facilities and systems as listed in the standard form XXX. For applicable non-federal information systems, that's your systems, contractors, The agency may conduct validation actions, and when they do, they will be conducted in accordance with NIST SP 800-171A and NIST SP 800-172A, respectively. NIST SP 800-171 and 172 are standardized sets of minimum requirements. Their companion documents, 171A and 172A, are standardized verification procedures for those requirements. They are much larger. They are much more detailed. They really ought to be one document, which the DoD did with CMMC, which they didn't have to do. So just know that although third-party verification like CMMC is not explicitly upfront, it can happen. It probably will happen in a lot of situations. And when that happens, there are other considerations for you to look at. We'll link to some videos below. We've been talking about this issue. I've been talking about this issue with Summit 7 literally since 2021. It was one of the first presentations I ever gave for Summit 7 was the fact that 171A exists. It's now called out explicitly in the clause, whereas before it was kind of buried in the DoD clauses. That's not a problem anymore.
Yeah, so it's just that overarching theme of harmonization and uniformity within the regulations. This is one of those ways that it gives a little bit of interpretation for the individual agencies, but it's kind of clear is the end result has to be the same. CUI has to be protected. It has to be validated to some way, whether that's you telling us, you submitting your SSP and your plan of action and milestones along with a score, hint, hint, wink, wink, or something like that. Like it's just things like these that we've already seen happen because we've been blessed with it in the DoD and they were forward thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, wrapping up the end of the clause here, there are general training requirements that you have to comply with. All of the details will be outlined in the standard form XXX. There's also a paragraph here about CUI incident reporting. For CUI in non-federally controlled facilities, the contractor shall report any suspected or confirmed CUI incident to the agency website or single point of contact identified in the standard form. Everything orbits around what's in the standard form. Please read it. It's at the end of the rule. Within 8 hours of discovery, 8 hours again. We'll talk about the 8 hours on another day, but that's what the rule currently says. And you need to report as many of the applicable data elements located at dibnet.dod.mil. What on earth? DoD figured out what the relevant items are for reporting incidents related to CUI, and then it was adopted by the entire federal-wide acquisition regulation? That's crazy. So good news, DoD contractors. The things you're already familiar with aren't changing. Bad news, everybody else. Everything that you thought that was unique to DoD, and you sure were glad that you weren't a DoD contractor, now apply to you.
Oh, I mean, what do you? I don't even know what you say. Do I say I'm sorry?
Every
what
non-defense contract, non-defense industry podcast, presentation, person that I have ever talked to, the one thing I have always told them is, even if you don't do business in the defense space, you need to pay attention to what is going on in cyber regulation in the defense space, because it is coming for you too. And here it is. The last part of this incident response part is something people are going to be very interested in. If the contractor is determined to be at fault for a CUI incident, for example, not safeguarding CUI in accordance with the contract requirements, the contractor may be financially liable for government costs incurred in the course of the response and mitigation efforts, in addition to any other damages at law or remedies available to the government for non-compliance. It's more than $5, so make sure you implement those requirements. And finally, in the clause, the last paragraph, paragraph H, subcontracts. The requirements flow down through the supply chain because the data flows down through the supply chain. So the contractor shall insert this clause, including this paragraph, without alteration, to identify all the parties in the supply chain and include the information in the standard form XXX modified as required for the CUI that applies to the subcontractor, and require subcontractors to notify the prime contractor or the next higher tier subcontractor within 8 hours of discovery of suspected or confirmed CUI incidents. So this affects direct awardees and contractors, and it affects all of their subcontractors down the supply chain as far as the relevant covered data flows through that supply chain, just like it has in the DoD space.
Yeah, this is nothing new to anybody that's operated in the DoD for the past 6 years.
Exactly. Okay, wrapping up here. So we've talked about why it's happening. We talked about who did it. We talked about who's affected. We talked about what the requirements are very briefly. Let's talk about everybody's favorite topic. How much is it going to cost?
Wait, why would somebody go out on a ledge and predict how much something like this would cost?
We'll get to that in a second.
Okay,
So the
why?
estimated cost of compliance in the rule has been separated for those requirements that are new to all federal contractors, including the defense space, and those that are new only for non-defense contractors. So new costs for everybody include things like familiarizing yourself with the rule, which they say should only take you 2 hours. I can tell you right now, it takes longer than 2 hours, and this is literally all I do. So that's not correct. Reviewing standard form triple X, they think that that should take you 2 hours. Doesn't make any sense because the standard form is 14 pages. The rule is 144 pages, and they said that both should take 2 hours. So, take it with a grain of salt. Please read the standard form if you don't read anything else. How long it takes for you to flow down the new clauses. They think that that also should take 2 hours. Anyways, the obligation to train employees if there are additional training requirements, and potentially complying with NIST SP 800-172 requirements, which are technically new for defense contractors as well. The estimate for the number of companies affected by 172, they say it'll only be 160 companies. I don't believe that for a second. But for small businesses, the cost to implement 172 on top of 171, they say will be about 200 grand. For medium-sized businesses, it'll be $1 million. And for larger businesses, you're talking 750 to 1,500 endpoints and beyond, $2.3 million. And the annual cost for maintaining the compliance in that environment with those requirements would be 20% of the cost of your initial implementation. We're going to have another episode about cost estimates for 172 from the DoD and cost estimates for 172 in here. Just know it's expensive.
We didn't just do it once, we did it twice.
Yeah.
I just thought about this. You want to know why we did it twice? Summit Up Live Denver. What did we talk about? 172. And what was one of the things that we presented? A cost estimate of what it would take to do this implementation yourself, as opposed to whatever. The cost estimate that we provided, I think it was like 200 and something. I think it was like 252. That's kind of close.
Yeah. Now, this is a historic moment. This is a historic part of a historic rule. The most historic part of all the historic stuff in the rule is this part of the rule.
Right.
They say that this is only a cost for non-defense contractors because technically defense contractors have had the obligation to implement the requirements in NIST SP 800-171 since 2016, right? But the government anywhere, never, anywhere, in any rule ever, anywhere, has ever estimated the cost of implementing NIST SP 800-171 requirements until now in this rule. They estimate that for small businesses, the initial implementation for labor and software will cost $175,000. And for non-small businesses, as they refer to them, the initial implementation of labor and software will cost $680,000. Now, I'll ask everybody to take a brief moment. We're going to link to a video that you and I put out on this podcast in October of 2023, where we took the official government cost estimate for implementing NIST SP 853, the Big Brother catalog, to 800-171. We measured and analyzed the percent of 171 that is taken from 853, and then did the math on what the percentage of the cost estimate would be for 800-171. And you know what number we came up with? $180,000. You know what number the government has come up with? $175,000. So for everybody who disliked that video and gave us the thumbs down, for everybody that left a nasty comment, for everybody who laughed in our faces, we'll wait. Go back to the video right now. We linked it below. Undo your dislike. Give it a thumbs up. And please edit your comments to say, actually, you guys were right all along. That's all I'm going to say about that.
All right. I'm going to take a deep breath so that I'm collected with what I say here. And all I want to say is never in my life have I been made to feel worse about being able to read books, regulations, or the tea leaves or the writing on the wall than when we put out this cost estimate. It was just only self-serving. We were evil people only because we were just reading and analyzing and making sense of this stuff. It wasn't for self-serving purposes. It was for everybody to raise every ship. Now we're here. Now we can get over it and move on and protect CUI. Sounds good?
Sounds great. We'll leave it there for historical reference for everybody. Okay, let's wrap up here. When is this happening? There's a lot of stuff going on. When is it happening? So this is what is known as a proposed rule. The regulation will not go into effect until after the public has had a chance to submit their comments on the rule. The government adjudicates those comments and then issues what is known as a final rule or a final regulation. That process in general takes about a year or so. So for now, call it the first half of 2026 when we would expect the final FAR CUI rule to then go into effect and start showing up in all federal contracts. Like we said before, there is no phased rollout for the FAR CUI rule like there is for DoD's specific CUI rules. And just so everybody knows, public comments are due by March 17th, 2025. We have a whole podcast that outlines what you need to do to submit effective public comments per the guidance that the government themselves have put out, which they, for some strange reason, never include in the rules when they ask for public comments. We'll link to that below if you don't know where to start. And in a nutshell, really big nutshell, several big nutshells, that is the FAR CUI rule. If you don't know where to start, check out our website. We have been working for years on this exact problem for a very specific set of defense contractors, and all of the things that we have learned, all of the free tools that we have created, all the blogs we've written, all the podcasts we put out, all the conferences that we've held are now applicable and available and relevant to you, federal contractors. You check out our website. We have a big conference coming up in May in Reston, Virginia called CS2. You can use our discount code scrolling across the bottom of the screen for discounted registration for in-person and for virtual. We do this podcast every week. We have free tools on our website, like the Pathfinder tool that tells you exactly how to get started, what the steps are that you need to take. We do a live Q&A every Friday. People can tune in on YouTube, on LinkedIn, and everywhere else, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Submit your questions. We literally have a hotline phone number that you can call and ask questions about what's going on. So check it out. Plenty of resources. And here we go. After the FAR CUI rule, it finally happened.
Parting thought, no phased rollout, and just double checking. GSA was that one organization that had those really, really, really fast PAL times, right?
That's right. That's
okay,
right.
just double checking. See you next week.
Yeah. All right. See you guys.